Good morning. I should have said aloha. Maybe I've got more of a response. It's good to be here with you today. I have long been fascinated by the Mormon Trail. It started when I was 14 years old, and my father took me and 3 of my siblings on a trip that followed the history of the movement of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from New York to Salt Lake City. We started in Palmyra, New York, the scene of Joseph Smith's first vision. Then we worked our way through various church history sites in Ohio and Illinois, drove along the Mormon Trail, and finally arrived in Salt Lake City before taking the Canadian route home to Ontario, Canada. As you can see from this particular picture, I still have the scrapbook where I placed all the pamphlets and postcards that I collected from this trip. Now, as was already mentioned in that gracious introduction, as a scholar whose research focuses on the intersections between religion, spirituality, pilgrimage, and tourism, the Mormon Trail continues to intrigue me, and in part because it is one of only a handful of non-First Nations religious trails in the United States. Every year, thousands of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints drive along the approximate route of the Mormon Trail, visiting many of the historical sites and signs that mark specific events in this mass migration of some 70,000 to 80,000 members of the church between 1846 and 1869 to Salt Lake City. As well, many church youth groups participate in what is called trek, in which they dress up in pioneer costumes and push or pull handcarts along sections of the original trail, or if they live far away, reenact the trek where they live, sometimes as far away as Australia. The question I and other scholars have long pondered is, why do members of the church drive along the Mormon Trail or participate in trek? This question is especially pertinent if one considers that the Latter-day Saint Church does not have a formal theology of pilgrimage. There is no merit to be gained from walking on or driving along the trail, and the hardships that accompany trek do not translate into a forgiveness of sins. As such, the Mormon Trail is not a pilgrimage trail in the traditional sense, like the Camino de Santiago de Compostela in Europe. Rather, church members engage in pilgrimage-like travel. Indeed, the Mormon Trail is an important part of the church's collective historical and spiritual consciousness, and travel along the Mormon Trail or reenacting the pioneer journey grounds the faith of church members in real space in a linear fashion. It is one thing to read the stories of the Mormon pioneers, it's another to be there, in the landscapes and places through which their spiritual ancestors walked. Through this type of quasi-pilgrimage travel, church members honor this legacy of faith, which legacy they seek to perpetuate in their daily lives. While the church has a long history of purchasing, reconstructing, and interpreting geographical locations important to the telling of the story of the restoration or founding of the church, the Mormon Trail is probably one of the most neglected of the church's historical spaces, probably because of the issue of preserving historical traces of the migration across a 1,300-mile corridor that cuts through public and private lands. And while the story of the Mormon Trail has been written about ad nauseum by historians, too often its story is either whittled down to a few represented, correlated vignettes of faith and travail, or, as demonstrated on this map, condensed into a few important places and events that are implicitly indicative of the collective experience of the saints as they walked towards their new Zion. Yet the story of the Mormon Trail is more than just a few historical vignettes or two-dimensional maps that list place names. What about the collective narrative of the 70,000 to 80,000 pioneers that walked this trail? Why are some pioneer journals and stories celebrated and used in Sunday school lessons and considered representative of the broader Mormon pioneer experience, while others go unnoticed? I wonder if there is a better way to present and teach the story of the Mormon Trail, not only to present and future generations of Latter-day Saints, but also to history seekers who are interested in the pioneer heritage of the United States. This is especially pressing considering recent changes in cartographic technologies and methods of historical interpretation that could be applied to this linear sacred route. Is there a way that we can better tell the story of this pioneer or human experience of the Mormon Trail, rather than just depict the locations and routes through which the saints have traveled? I am grateful for, is it Dr. or Brother or President Bennett's invitation to speak to you about a multidisciplinary project granted in its very early infancy that seeks to revisualize the way in which the Mormon Trail is mapped and how its story is told. Before discussing this project, I wish to briefly review some of the ways in which the Mormon Trail has been cartographically depicted before discussing how framing can be used to present the human experience of the Mormon pioneers. I then wish to briefly discuss how deep mapping can further help us share the collective story of the Mormon pioneers before concluding. While Brigham Young and the other early pioneers relied on maps of the Great Plains and the rugged Rocky Mountains from various sources, including military and government maps, and maps drawn by several explorers, such as John Charles Fremont, whose map is shown up here on the screen, church leaders did not initially create their own maps to show the pioneers that would follow them the way to the Salt Lake Valley. The reason for this was that the trail the Vanguard Pioneer Company led by Brigham Young was blazing was not considered a one-time, one-way traverse. Rather, it was envisioned that this trail would become a permanent pathway towards the new center of Mormonism. As such, Brigham Young's plan was to send guides from the Salt Lake Valley back to the Midwest, improving roads and building bridges as necessary in order to help future migrants more easily endure the hardships of the Pioneer Trail. Thus, there was no need for the creation of a map. This was exemplified in William Clayton's 1848 Latter-day Saints Immigrants Guide, which, while listing important landmarks and the distance and direction from one landmark to the next, did not include a map. Eventually, enterprising Mormon and non-Mormon entrepreneurs began to make maps to both facilitate and financially capitalize on pioneer travel to Utah, especially for the building of the Transcontinental Railway. One of the maps that I particularly like is the one shown on the screen, entitled Route of the Mormon Pioneers from Nauvoo to Great Salt Lake, created and printed by Milroy and Hayes Salt Lake City-based printers. Compiled in part from several maps created by earlier explorers, this map charts the journey of the Vanguard Company based on the record kept by Apostle Orson Pratt. This map takes a very romantic view of the Mormon migration, with its depictions of pioneer companies, buffalo, the Mormon Battalion, First Nations cultural groups, and other Western scenery at the margins of the map. While there are other types of maps like this one that you can buy on websites such as Etsy, where artists are also creating Mormon Trail maps that are as much about aesthetics or maps to be viewed for their own sake as they are about historical accuracy and representation, I wish to focus on some examples of more modern, utilitarian, and academic maps that are presently available for public consumption for those that wish to learn more about the history of the Mormon Trail. This first map is from the National Park Service. This map, while lacking significant detail, does suggest to the reader that there is something important about this line that has been superimposed upon this base map. That line, of course, is the Mormon Trail. However, outside of this line, there is no real story being told. This map, depicting the first part of the Mormon pioneer trek through Iowa, is one of several maps that cover the entirety of the Mormon Trail, as part of an article written by scholar Stanley B. Kimball for the Latter-day Saint Church's Ensign magazine, now called the Liahona, back in 1979. While lacking a legend, this map not only shows the Mormon Trail, but also modern-day locations that help readers to better situate the Mormon Trail in the modern cultural and physical landscape. What I like about this map, and I've highlighted it in red, is that Dr. Kimball begins to highlight stories and events that might be of interest to readers, including the staging ground for the Mormon Exodus, where a horse was healed, and where the beloved Latter-day Saint hymn, Come, Come Ye Saints, was composed by William Clayton. This map goes beyond landscapes to begin telling a story, a narrative that helps readers to spatially contextualize some of the events of this pioneer journey. Now, I probably gave a pretty bad impression of the National Park Service and their mapping capabilities, although in our last presentation that was well disabused. But here, what we see is the map that was already shown. The National Park Service has done something very similar to what Dr. Kimball did, where it shows the line on the map of the Mormon Trail, but also highlights different points of interest in red, and summarizing the important points along the Mormon Trail. If we zoom in to this particular section of Wyoming, there are two lines that depict the original Mormon Trail. There's a red dotted line showing where the original wagon ruts are visible, and a solid red line where there are no original wagon ruts, and a black line that shows the highway along which people can travel. And again, the red writing highlights different locations and events that are important to the telling of the pioneer story. Here's another example from the Department of Archaeology at the University of Iowa as part of an effort to identify, preserve, and develop the trails and associated points of interest as a historical resource for the state of Iowa. In this map, we see orange lines in the south showing the first years of the Mormon Trail, and then green lines showing the overland path of the Mormon pioneers who used handcarts. And there are other minor pioneer pathways depicted here as well. While the map makers do highlight important locations along the Mormon Trail, they expand upon the importance of these trails in the margins of the map without using lines that take a paragraph and connect it to a particular location. And so while this is a good example of narrative or telling a story, maybe there's a better way of doing this, like at least putting lines between a point and the corresponding paragraph. Here is another example from a website I found by Frank Nelson, who is a descendant of Mormon pioneers, who sells this and other maps related to the Mormon Trail on his website. He is using the Malloy and Hayes map that I showed you previously and provides a lot of narrative content in his version of the Mormon Trail, highlighting key stopping points and stories along the way. Here is another map, or series of maps, that he has created as well, highlighting the beginning and the end of the Mormon Trail, Nauvoo, Illinois, and Salt Lake City. But while these maps are full of narrative content, maybe there's too much narrative content. I personally am a bit overwhelmed when I look at these maps, and there's a lot that I have to digest. And a lot of times when we take a look at maps, we want to see the story just at first glance, not necessarily by doing a deep dive into all the text that is surrounding the line, as we see in this particular example. Now, these maps that we have looked at so far are non-interactive. They're static. The map reader cannot manipulate these maps in a meaningful manner to dig deeper into the story. However, some Mormon Trail maps incorporate more user interactivity. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has several maps on their website that focus on the Mormon Handcart Trail, the Mormon Battalion, Nauvoo to Winter's Quarters, and other Latter-day Saint themed trails in Missouri and Ohio. This map here is a map of the Mormon Handcart Trail. Here we see the movement of Latter-day Saints that came to the United States, whether by sailboat or steamboat, train, or handcart, and then eventually made their way to Salt Lake City. If I click on that blue plus sign on the left-hand side of the screen, it takes me to Wyoming. And if I zoom in even further by clicking that blue and white plus sign, it takes me to Martin's Cove, where then I can go into deeper detail looking at some of the historical features of this particular site. And if I click on this particular section here in the eastern part of Iowa, it takes me to a little vignette of Florence, which I can then read a little bit more about to see why this area is important to the historical consciousness of Latter-day Saints. The National Park Service, as we've already seen in our last presentation, does something very similar, where if I click on this number 18, obviously there are 18 different historical sites there. I can zoom in to where there's 11, and I can zoom into where there is 8, zoom into where there is 2. I can click on this particular point, and it takes me to the Kanesville Tabernacle and Visitor Center, in which then I can click on the website, taking me to another page so I can learn more about the history of these particular locations. The maps that we have reviewed so far, though, are place-based. They're place-focused, with an emphasis on what happened where, sprinkling with the occasional personal narrative with experiences and campsites that are viewed by someone as indicative of the overall pioneer experience. To me, what these maps are missing are the lived experiences of the Mormon pioneers. How can we create maps that are people-based and experience-based, not place-based? How can we tell the day-to-day stories of the Mormon pioneers in a meaningful and experiential way, particularly in a world where people are becoming more visual rather than archival when it comes to learning about history? One way to better depict the experiences of the Mormon pioneers is through framing, in which we just kind of focus on one particular story and look at the day-to-day narratives that they shared in their journal. So for example, going back to this Milroy and Hayes map, if we zoom in, what we find is not only is the linear path the Vanguard Company took across the plains depicted here, but also every single day where they stopped and how far they traveled. What we do with framing is we would take May 24th, 22nd, or 23rd to the 24th, and we would try to figure out what happened on that day, and then try to figure out how do we depict the experiences of that particular pioneer group during that day, and then how do we actually represent that on a map. This is kind of what happened with this other map I showed you previously, where the same distances and stopping locations were also shown on this map. But many years ago, I went to the annual conference of the Association of American Geographers. And while I was there walking through some poster sessions, I came across this particular map by Dr. Margaret Pierce. I was very intrigued by this map. I didn't know what this map was about, but just looking at it, I wanted to know more. Just because there's a bunch of colors, what do the colors represent? There's a little bit of red there. There must be something significant about each of these different boxes. In a paper she subsequently published on the construction of this map, she wrote that the conventions of Western cartographic language, the visual variables in the grammar, are structured to communicate spaces of homogeneity and modernity, not the spaces shaped by human experience. Her concern, like mine, was how can we map the human experience? Now, what she could have done, she did this research looking at some Northwest Company fur traders or voyageurs up in the Canadian interior and the path that they took from Lake Athabasca to Lachine Rapids. She could have very easily done a map like this, put on a bunch of numbers in certain important locations, and then led the reader to an appendix where it was, number one, this is why it's important, that sort of thing. But she said, I want to represent this in a way that people can see the story rather than have to go somewhere else to read it. So what happened was she found a journal by John MacDonald, who was one of these voyageurs and had written every single day how far he traveled and what his experiences were. And then each box represents a day of travel, and each color represents the mood that John MacDonald was in for that particular day. And if we zoom in, what we find is that there's a little quote from his journal for every single day that he put a journal entry in for. To me, if I take a look at a map like this is a much more inviting than some of the other maps that we have taken a look at today. I would see this map and say, there's a story. I see the story, but I want to know more about that story. And as soon as I saw this map, I thought this would be a great way to try to remap the Mormon Trail. This takes us to something that we call deep mapping. Because of time, I'm going to kind of skip over all the other jargon. But the key point here is that last phrase, flat ontology. Ontology is a study of what is real. And what happens is we usually take our maps that take human experiences and events and places where they occurred. We map them, in this case, the Mormon Trail from point A to point B. We highlight different places, people traveling through three-dimensional space, trying to depict it onto two-dimensional space. We highlight certain points, and then we say, well, why are these points important? Because we have taken someone's biography, in this case, one of the journals of the Mormon pioneers, and we've said, oh, these are the experiences they had at these places. We think they're important to telling the story, so we map the places based upon this one group or this one person's experiences. But how do you depict all the other experiences, which probably were different pioneers going to a particular location, all having different experiences? This is what we mean by deep mapping. How do we actually, on a map, show multiple experiences? This is actually a very difficult thing to do. There is a lot going on right now in the cartographic literature, trying to figure out not how do we make a deep map? What's the methodology, the methods we use to do this? Because not only are you taking one person's experience of the Mormon Trail, but then you have to correlate that with multiple experiences of the Mormon Trail, and then you have to figure out how to overlay all these experiences on the same map. This is something, again, that cartographers are working on, and we don't have some really good solutions on how to actually do this. But this is what my particular group is going to try to accomplish, so that not only can we try to tell the story of the Mormon Trail a little bit better, maybe make it more meaningful as a pedagogical tool, but also to then influence the way that maps are made in the broader cartographic context. So what I want to do is, first of all, make a map like this. This is kind of my dream, is to make a map of the Mormon Trail like this as a way of making it a pedagogical tool that might be of more value and use to people who are interested in the Mormon Trail. And then from there, we want to continue working on this idea of deep mapping. I don't know if I've accomplished what Dr. Bennett wanted me to do in this presentation, but if anything, I hope I made you think a little deeper about the stories of the Mormon Trail, how they have been and can be presented in a cartographic form. Thank you for your kind attention.
About 8 minutes in which we can take questions, either from the virtual audience or from those in the auditorium. Does anyone have a question for one of our presenters? Oh, you're a lively lot. Yes, please.
Was it Milroy Hayes map?
Yes.
When was that created?
I believe it was in the late 1800s.
Was that a common way of mapping at the time, contextually?
So there were basically two ways to make a map. You can make it to be as authentic and accurate as possible, depicting events, or if you want to sell more, you make it look pretty. And so that was part of the point. So you have the Transcontinental Railway that's being built in 1869. You have all these non-Mormons who are floating to Salt Lake City, wanting to know more about the Mormons and what they've been setting up in Salt Lake City. And so it wasn't just Milroy and Hayes, but you also have the train companies who are also paying map makers to make these maps as value added. So you would travel, you'd buy this map, it would kind of romanticize the whole migration experience of, on the Oregon Trail, that sort of thing. So, but for centuries, even I have a map in my office of the British Empire that shows their territorial extent. 24% of the world's land ownings was theirs at their peak. And all around the edges, all this symbolism and talking about why the British Empire was so important and why these people should be so grateful that they're part of the British Empire. So a lot of times, of course, as academics, we want kind of the authenticity, the accuracy, but a lot of times people just want something nice to hang on their wall to make it a conversation piece, and that's why that map was really important at the time. Great question.
Question for Dr. Bennett. Was the Mormon Trail ever modified for the needs that you mentioned? They had to stay close to Missouri farms for supplies, work, that sort of thing. Did the Missourians ever get wise to who it was they were actually benefiting, or didn't it matter?
Well,
Gentlemen, sorry, real quick, can you make sure you repeat those questions into the mic
Yes.
so online can hear? Thank you.
did they ever modify their trail, right, Jim? Is that your question? And did the Missourians know who was coming down? Well, some of them did, some of them didn't. A lot of Missourians were not opposed to the Latter-day Saints. I think it's a mistake to think that they were all enemies of the Latter-day Saints. That wasn't the case. But to be careful, we did go down disguised and didn't let on who we were. We kept changing the route as we were going across Iowa. That became a major discussion point, if not debate, particularly between George Miller, who was quite the Iowa Trail expert, and Brigham Young. They kept arguing over where they should go. And at one point, they thought they were going to actually have to change and go down to what's called Banks Ferry, now near St. Joseph, Missouri. That's what they almost decided to go that way and then back up through Bellevue and follow the California Trail on the south side, not even come to Council Bluffs. But as time went on, they persisted in their initial desire to get to Council Bluffs, but through many different modifications and changes on site, as the weather permits, because the weather is constantly challenging them. They're not getting across nearly as fast. And so there are all kinds of modifications going on the spot. It's interesting that in the midst of all that rain and thunder and everything else, they're not going across, one wagon after another. They're spread-eagled across about a mile across, different ridges and everything else. And Brigham Young, when he wanted to meet with all of his captains, he would raise a flag up high above his wagon, different colored flags to try to get all the captains to come together. But George Miller said, I don't want to go back and talk to Brother Brigham. He says, I know where he's not going in the right direction anyway. And so they would have these great discussions in the middle of Iowa as to where they're going. And it was a consternation to Brother Brigham that some were doing their own thing. But they finally made it.
Question here for you.
I have a question about the population in Iowa at about the same time that the approximate population in Iowa at the same time that the pioneers were crossing, was it highly populated?
No.
Densely populated?
I can't give you the exact population of Iowa. Now, Iowa becomes a state in December 1846, but this much we do know, that the eastern part of the state was obviously settled first, particularly along the Des Moines River and areas like we mentioned, Keosauqua, Bentonsport, eventually Des Moines, what have you. It was a few thousand, but I can't give you the exact number. But amongst the Latter-day Saints in various ways, you're going to have about 10 to 12,000 moving across Iowa. But I will say this much, that most Iowans were very kind to the Latter-day Saints and open. And many times the Saints would put on concerts in the middle of these storms and rains and everything else. They would go and play concerts in the band halls in Bentonsport and Keosauqua for funds to help with the costs of moving west, and Iowa was receptive to that.
I have a question for Brother Olsen. As a mother of teenagers, of all of the maps, if you wanted to get your teenagers to be interested and they love to click, and if you wanted to, kind of get them to be willing to stop at sites, not Pisgah and things, as we're coming from Waterloo to Council Bluffs, what is the best map, in your opinion?
Are we talking about an online map? Or are we talking about online map?
Best if it was online.
The National Park Service probably has the best map right now because they are focused on the idea of place, not so much on experiences, even though we talked a little bit about authenticity a little bit. That's a story for another day. But I think that would be the best map to go, where you can drive along and you can click on, and you're coming up on this site, you can click on it, and then you can kind of get a bit of the story before you actually show up. I suggest that would be the best map. But there probably are people that are out there. I think part of my mapping project is we actually want to create an app that you can take with you as you travel along the trail. And since I do a little bit of tourism work, not just make it, here's the different places along the Mormon Trail you want to see, but here's where you can eat, here's where you can stay, and so make it more of an interactive travel guide at some point, so that so you can learn the story as you're going, but also where can I go for ice cream? But that, again, will be a little bit ways away.
The question has been sent in virtually. How many different routes were used by the Latter-day Saints? I'm assuming that's trailed across Iowa. Dr. Bennett?
Well, there are many local trail scholars who could probably answer that better. It's constantly in flux. It's changing. As they're going across, they're finding ways. It would have been better to go on this ridge. It would have been better going on this ridge. And they're sending back word constantly to those following behind to take slight variations in the trail. I don't have major changes in the trail across Iowa. You'll remember that they will stop in Garden Grove and put in a way station there, a farm, and that's going to last for 4 or 5 years. And people are going to be coming there later on, and also in Mount Pisgah the same way, and sometimes they're going to take slight deviations. It's shorter, it's richer, it's faster, what have you. But the basic trail, especially west of Mount Pisgah, is going to be pretty well clear, straight across. And today would be near to Highway 92 from that area to Council Bluffs. And of course, on the east side of Iowa, along Highway 2. But there are variations of the trail. It's not exactly in the very same place, but generally speaking, in some of the sessions we're going to be having just shortly here, we're going to be exploring that much more carefully.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our time. One more question. All right, go ahead.
It's been commented there were 12,000-some Mormon pioneers traversing across Iowa. That sounds pretty impressive, but how many animals did they have with them that they had to pasture and feed and take care of traveling across Iowa?
Okay, so for the virtual audience, the question was asked, some 12,000 Latter-day Saints crossed on the trail. How many animals did they have to bring with them? That's the question? All right.
Which animals did you have in mind, Carl? Well, I made a list of some of them there. The Latter-day Saints were rich in cattle. They were very poor and otherwise, but one of my master's students wrote his thesis on the cattle, and we're talking tens of thousands of cattle in different places and at different times. I can't give you an actual number, Carl, but there were tens of thousands. And that's one of the reasons they were worried about when they were leaving, because they got to think about all their cattle. And, you know, leaving the wintertime is not a smart idea. You got to wait for the grass to come up, and this becomes a very, very big issue. I can't give you the exact number, and goats and sheep and everything else, but the Latter-day Saints had enormous herds of cattle. Now, at winter quarters, there are so many that they have to settle north of here. As you well know, Carl, there's going to be up to what they call the pea mines, up the Missouri River, where there tens of thousands of cattle are going to be there that they're going to take care of. So let's just put it that way. There are so many that we can't count them.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We'll take a break for 15 minutes and convene back here again at 10:30. Thank you.